Good evening. I'm John Miko. I'm the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's very special Civil War Roundtable. This is part of the Union League's 160th celebration, anniversary celebration, I should say. And what a great speaker and a great event we have tonight. Tomorrow, of course, is the 200th anniversary of Grant's birth. And we celebrate that in many ways, and no more appropriate than a Civil War Roundtable. So thank you for being here. I want to recognize the chair of the 160th Committee, Bob Cavalier, who's right over here. Bob, thank you for your leadership. And the chair of the Education Committee of the Union League Legacy Foundation, which puts all the great work that we have. And right now we are in full force with scholarship, 2 different scholarship days of interviews the last 2 days, Good Citizen Day, lecture programs like this. All of that comes under Steve Target's leadership. Steve, thank you for your leadership. And of course, my boss, Ms. Joan Carter. Thank you, Joan. All the great work of the Legacy Foundation is made possible through your support. So I thank you for your voluntary contributions to the Legacy Foundation. If you haven't yet made a contribution this year, and our year is over on June 30th, please make a contribution. If you don't know how to do that, talk to me, talk to Kristen Moran, or talk to our chair of our development committee, Gary Dorsheimer, who's somewhere in here. Thank you, Gary, for your leadership. So tonight's program, before I do that, please, if you would, a few housekeeping things. Turn off your cell phone, or at least silence it, please. Our program tonight will run about an hour in total. We'll include, of course, a lecture, and then we will have questions, which we'll take via microphone. We'll have staff around the room. Please use the microphone because we are streaming live. And of course, as always, 2-3 sentences. And if you can't put a question mark on the end of it, you failed. And our crack AV staff actually has the switch button that could just, so we would appreciate that. We have a couple of great programs coming up on May 5th. We have a wonderful program with John Yoo. It's going to be moderated by Ed Trzanski on China, Russia, and Ukraine. And then we have one on May 10th on the Brooklyn Bridge, a library hour. So I hope you'll be attending those. And now, to introduce our program, is a man who's been a great advocate of U.S. Grant for many years, member of the board of the Legacy Foundation, my friend, Mr. Ed Trzanski. Ed.
John, thanks very much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And as John said, for your continued support of the Legacy Foundation, which makes all of these programs possible. Also, as John noted, this program tonight is the culmination of many years of discussion focused on how we can best honor one of the most consequential heroes of our republic, Ulysses S. Grant, a man who was once routinely mentioned along with Washington and Lincoln. But for reasons our speaker may get into, he had also fallen into disfavor, if not obscurity. Happily, on this, the eve of the bicentennial of his birth, the Union League inaugurates what will be a yearly observance honoring our 18th president with a presentation by an historian whose work has driven a popular, renewed appreciation for the great man. Ronald C. White has written several outstanding books on the life and works of our 16th president. Perhaps the best of an outstanding group is his A. Lincoln, a biography. 6 years ago, he turned his considerable literary and historical talents to the topic of restoring Grant to his proper place of honor with the publication of Ulysses Grant, American Ulysses, A Life of U.S. Grant. This work was recognized in 2017 with the William Henry Seward Award for Excellence in Civil War Biography. Dr. White is a graduate of UCLA and Princeton Theological Seminary, having earned a PhD in religion and history from Princeton University. He's a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C., and has taught at UCLA, Whitworth University, Colorado College, and Princeton Theological Seminary. He's lectured at the White House, has been interviewed on PBS, on its NewsHour, and he's spoken on Lincoln in England, France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and New Zealand. And tonight, he's here to speak to us about our 16th president and the victorious commanding general in the War of the Confederate Rebellion, U.S. Grant. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium Ronald C. White.
I can feel the energy in the room, and Ed told me he's been advocating for this for 12 years. Let's give him a hand. Terrific. Grant is rising at 200. C-SPAN does presidential historian surveys, and they have done 4 in the 21st century. They do one every time there's a change of presidents. And in those 4 presidential historian surveys, Grant has risen 13 places. 13 places. Dwight Eisenhower is second, having risen 4 places in those surveys. This morning in Washington, D.C. at 10:30 a.m., there was a ceremony in front of the marvelous Grant Memorial. If you have not seen that, you may not even know it's there, but it is there. It's the largest equestrian statue in America, and it's been recently restored. This is Grant's 200th birthday. It is the 100th birthday of the Grant Memorial. How marvelous. When I wrote my biography of Abraham Lincoln, obviously Ulysses S. Grant was in the biography. And my editor at Random House, bless editors, said, "Why don't you do a biography of Grant? Don't you think he's due for an upgrade?" So I began, but within 6 to 9 months, I had to come to this confession. I didn't really know the man. He was in the Lincoln biography, but I didn't really know who he was. And I came to the larger conclusion that so many of us do not know who he is. When we were in school, if he was mentioned at all, what was he? He was a drunk. He was a butcher, no comparison to Robert E. Lee. And he had all these scandals in his administration. So how do we understand Ulysses S. Grant and the question you've asked, Ed, in your introduction, why has he risen? Of course, he fell. We should start with that by what's called the lost cause. The lost cause was something that began immediately after the Civil War, put forward by both newspaper editors and ex-Confederate generals, arguing that really the South was the better part of the nation. They had only lost because they were overwhelmed by a larger Union army, by the industrial might of the North, and by that butcher Grant, who was heedless of his casualties. And so that story continued forward. And believe it or not, it continued into the 20th century. So in the 1930s, there was an effort to write a whole series of presidential biographies. Alan Nevins edited that task. And they assigned to a very esteemed historian at the University of Wisconsin, William Heseltine, to write the biography of Grant, which he did in 1935. And this is what he wrote. His mental endowment was not great, and he filled his state papers with platitudes instead of thoughts. As for Grant as president, he was unprepared by the experience and unendowed with the native gifts necessary for a successful political career. Well, recently now, get ready for the next one, there have been two marvelous Grant editions of the Grant memoirs, both annotated. Grant memoirs have never been out of print. This is what Heseltine said about Grant. Grant himself was a poor writer. So Grant had fallen in this story. But who is this Grant? When I started into my biography, I had to confront a puzzle of many different pieces. I believe, first of all, that we don't spend enough time on the youthful part of the persons we study. Think of your own lives. When you were 16, 18, 20, 22, oh, you're a different person today, but isn't that so formative? So Grant said, the reason I do not read biographies is because they do not tell enough about the formative period of a person's life. I want to know what a man did as a boy, or we would add what a woman did as a girl. And so I wanted to spend time on that. My early readers said, oh my goodness, you got to get on to the general. No, I think it's really important to understand, how is this person formed? What are his or her values? Secondly, I wanted to spend time trying to understand Julia Dent, Grant's wife. We've overlooked women in our writing of American history. She's a remarkable person. If we often say opposites attract, this might be true. Grant was often called Grant the Silent. If you had invited him to speak tonight, he would have deferred. She was a much more social person, and they would stand together in a White House reception line, and she was marvelous in getting everybody involved and being gracious and empathetic. And he was so devoted to her. People found them 30 years into their marriage holding hands as they were together there in the White House. She could have stayed away during the Civil War, but I was surprised she spent so much of her time with him in those very difficult battle situations. So I wanted to understand Julia. Who was Julia? I was also interested in the friendships that Grant had. Talk about a friendship of opposites. William Tecumseh Sherman, this guy that's just jumping out of his shoes. But he and Grant formed this incredible friendship, just amazing, loyal to each other. And then I think a very missing part of almost all American biographies is what I would call the faith story. I discerned that in Abraham Lincoln, who in his second inaugural will suddenly in 701 words mention God 14 times, quote the Bible 4 times, and invoke prayer 3 times, but I thought he wasn't a religious person. He never did join a church. Where did that come from? Well, there's a new volume that's going to come out on Grant. I think it's been delayed by the supply chain. And I've written a chapter in it which I call The Son of Methodism, because I'm trying to discern, where do these values come from? What were they formed by? And I think his Methodist heritage, especially his mother, is incredibly important. Why did Grant become such a humble person? Where does this self-effacement come from? Where does always giving credit to other people? I think it's his Methodism, which was the greatest, largest denomination in the middle of the 19th century. So these are qualities that I wanted to sort of sketch out. What I'd like to do first is to imagine Grant arriving once again in Washington, D.C. He arrived the first time in March of 1864. He came on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He hired a carriage, and he took him to what they then called Willard's Hotel. He walked up to the front desk, and he asked for a room. And the desk keeper said, "Sir, do you not know that we're in the midst of a civil war?" Grant had a duster that covered his Union uniform. He always wore a private's uniform. Only you could tell he was a general by the stars on his shoulder. "Do you not know that we're in the midst of a civil war and that Willard's is the greatest hotel in Washington?" And he said, "Well, whatever you have." He said, "Well, I can find you a very, very small room on the 6th floor, the top floor." "That will be fine," said General Grant softly. He said, "Would you please sign the register?" He signed the register, U.S. Grant and son, Galena, Illinois. The man turned pale. He was aghast. He said, "Why didn't you tell me who you were? And if you won't permit me to kind of insert ourselves, we know politicians, sports stars, music stars, celebrities, don't you know who I am?" No, Ulysses S. Grant would never have said such a thing. And so he accepted that room. The desk keeper gave him an envelope, which was from President Abraham Lincoln, inviting him to come that night to the White House, and the next day to assume command of all the Union armies. They had never met. They formed this remarkable, what I would call mutual appreciation company. Both were Western men. Grant never complained, never like McClellan said, "Oh, the enemy's too large." He just did his job and gave credit to others. So let me this evening just tell 3 different episodes of his life, which I think help us understand who is Ulysses S. Grant and why should we be suggesting that he rise in 2022. Grant assumes command from Lincoln, but he did not assume command from the soldiers. They whispered behind his back, "He's never met Bobby Lee. He's never met Bobby Lee. He's been out in the minor leagues, Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chattanooga. 4 armies had entered Virginia, and 4 armies had left Virginia in retreat. He's never met Bobby Lee." So on May 4, 1864, Grant mounts his huge 17 hands high horse, Cincinnati, and crosses the Rapidan River into Virginia. His army is twice the size of Lee, but, and we're learning this, aren't we, about Ukraine? Ukraine is fighting its own territory, and it knows its land in the way the Russians do not. And so Lee has a terrific advantage, even though he has a smaller army. So Grant enters what is called the wilderness. I walked the wilderness. It's a series of scrub oak trees, only 4 or 5 feet tall, deeply compacted to each other. So Grant's advantage in artillery is not an advantage. His horses, his cavalry doesn't really work in that kind of situation. He goes forward. And suddenly the words that come in a later war, friendly fire, begin to take place as men fall out of ammunition, formation and are shooting their rifles. Suddenly they're sometimes shooting their own men. And then worst of all, by noon, the forest catches fire, and men begin to be burned to death, or they shoot themselves before they will be burned to death. And at the end of 2 days, Grant has lost a great number of men, more than he ever anticipated. Some of you have seen the movie Lincoln. I've seen it 7 times with children, grandchildren. It's a great movie. You may remember that Lincoln is often in the telegraph office. So he's in the telegraph office trying to find out what is going on in the wilderness. But the Confederates have cut the telegraph lines, so he has no possibility of communication. So at the end of the 2nd day, a Union general rides into the camp where Grant is, and he says, "I know what Lee is going to do. He's going to do this, and he's going to do that, and he's going to do this, and he's going to do that." And Grant the Silent, who is sitting there listening to this, suddenly rises up and he says, "I am heartily tired of hearing what Lee is going to do. Some of you seem to think he's going to do a double somersault and land on both sides of our flanks at the same time. I want to discover what we are going to do." Well, right at that moment, one of the senior war correspondents says, "I'll give $1,000 to anyone who will try to get through to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln needs to know what is happening." So young Henry Wing, 24 years old, steps forward and says, "I will make that attempt." He then, just before he leaves, he walks over to Grant and he says, "Is there anything, sir, that you would like me to say to President Lincoln?" I can imagine that Grant paused, and then he said, "Tell him simply this: there will be no turning back. There will be no turning back." One of the great surprises and delights for me in writing this biography occurred shortly after it was published. I was contacted by General David Petraeus, And he asked if I would be willing to do an event with him. We've now done 4 events, and we'll do an event tomorrow night in New York with he and Ron Chernow and myself. And General David Petraeus believes that Grant, without question, is the greatest American general. When he went to lead the surge in Iraq, he read Grant's memoirs, and he asked his soldier generals to read Grant's memoirs. And he could tell you in great detail why this is the greatest general in American history. Well, part of it is that he is so determined. And he loves to tell this story of Shiloh. On the first day, there's no denying that Grant and the Union Army was surprised by the Confederates. They were almost pushed into the Tennessee River. And at the end of that evening, at the end of that day, Grant is not wanting to go into the hospital where they're field hospital, where they're amputating legs and arms. He cannot stand that. The rain is coming down, and so he's literally standing, trying to sleep underneath a tree. And Sherman comes upon him and says, "We have really had a difficult day today." And General Petraeus loves to say this. Grant says, "Yep, but we're going to lick them tomorrow." And that's exactly what took place. So Henry Wing makes his way forward and gets to Lincoln and gets to the White House and arrives there and gives Lincoln this message. And Lincoln says, in effect, if any other general would have been in this situation, we would have been on the road back to Washington. So the next morning, Grant says to Meade, "I'm going to give an order, but I don't want it given until 8:30 tonight. We're going to march." And at 8:30 that evening, imagine the smoke, the fire, it's still all burning. I've been in that place. And Grant starts out for what's called the Chancellorsville Junction. And you get to that place, and if you turn left, you go back to Washington. And if you turn right, you go to Richmond. And the word is out. Grant is coming, and his huge, high, 17 hands horse Cincinnati is prancing in the twilight. And the soldiers all cluster around that Chancellorsville Junction. Fortunately for us, and I haven't even started my deal, so look, I got carried away. Pardon me. Got carried away. Okay. Back to the beginning. This is a medallion from the 1870s. And who does it show but the 3 greatest American leaders? Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Ulysses S. Grant. This is the way people thought in the 1870s, Americans. I skipped too quickly over the fact that when Grant was educated at West Point, posted out to both Oregon and California, deeply missing Julia and a child he'd never seen, he resigned from the military. Came back and lived kind of in the shadow of Julia's father, which was a difficult thing because he was an ardent pro-slavery person. And he had a hard time. He struggled to do various things, especially being a farmer. And finally, one day I found this in the Abraham Lincoln Library in Springfield, Illinois. You can see the date on it. Grant walked into St. Louis and put into a pawn shop his gold watch that he could somehow buy Julia a Christmas present. Amazing. I think it's so important for all of our lives. You would all understand this. We all are going to deal with defeat. We're all going to deal with failure. The question simply is, how do we deal with it? How do we understand what we've done, and can we learn from our mistakes? We will make mistakes, but politicians will make mistakes. But I'm interested in how individuals move forward from those mistakes. So the soldiers, when Grant took that turn towards Richmond, they leapt into the air. A person there will show you this right now. Here's Grant, the general, 5'7", maybe 5'8", not a particularly person that you would spot and say, "Oh my goodness, he looks like he's out of central casting." No, he doesn't. And here's this scene at Chancellorsville Crossing. And you can see if you look carefully, this is an illustrator, the men are throwing their hats in the air. They're finally going to Richmond, and they're actually singing. It's a singing army. Aren't we glad to get out of the wilderness? Aren't we glad to get out of the wilderness? Lincoln had given them command, but now the soldiers gave Grant command. Now they understood why Lincoln had brought him from the West. They'd gone through all these other generals, but now Grant is the general that will lead the Union Army to victory. Well, we pretty much know that story, and that story has been brought back to fore. Actually, military historians long ago, it's not maybe quite got into the public consciousness, would say, well, Grant is a far superior general than Robert E. Lee. His casualties are not higher than Robert E. Lee, and on and on and on. But what has been missing in this is the story of Grant as president, because that seemed to be either something missing in the biography, or isn't Grant not a very good president? So the challenge for myself, Ron Chernow, and others is to say, let's take a fresh look at that presidency. Who is Grant as president? What's very interesting is when he is elected president, you remember after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson was the president, and it was an absolute disaster. And so Grant, I think, never wanted to be president. He says to Sherman after he's elected, I was forced into this in spite of myself. If I did not accept this role, we would forfeit everything we thought we had won in the Civil War. So the idea that he felt this was a calling that came from others, it didn't come from within himself. Of course, he was an ambitious person, but he also had this sort of sense of history and humility. So this evening, we could talk about a variety of the things that he did as president that have been minimized, but now maybe brought back into the light. In his inaugural address, to the surprise of everyone, he said, we have treated the American Indian terribly, and we must change that. Well, how are we going to change that? He invited the leaders of all the Protestant denominations and the Catholic Church to the White House before the first month of his administration was over. He said, you know how to work with people. You have mission agencies. I want us to reconstitute the way we will somehow treat the American Indian. The United States was still very angry with England, because you remember that England built the raiding ships that the Confederacy used to attack not simply Union military vessels, but merchant ships. But Grant recognized that going forward into the 20th century, England could and should become our best ally. So he put together a way of arbitration, took place in Geneva, Switzerland, to sort of settle our differences, not by war, and to somehow get England to admit what they had done. They paid a fee to the United States for the damage that we incurred from them. But he started to build this remarkable friendship with England, which we sort of almost take for advantage today. But the real challenge in Grant's presidency, and actually a reason that he fell, was the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. He was born in 1866, originally just as a fraternal organization, but quickly it became a violent organization. Today we would call it a white supremacist, we would call it a terrorist organization. And these persons beat, whipped, maimed, kidnapped, hanged thousands of Black citizens. I spoke a couple of years ago at a college in Montgomery, Alabama, and there they've put together this amazing monument on hanging. It just takes your breath away how much hanging has taken place in this country, town by town, county by county. So Grant, in an interesting way, as his own Republican Party started to step back, and there's kind of a biblical verse that says do not grow weary in well-doing. The Republicans had sponsored and passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But you know, it's sometimes hard to keep doing something, even if you think it's right. And so the Republican Party was kind of growing weary of this. We'll just let the South solve this problem. But Grant, a kind of a latecomer to this, steps forward and says, no, we have to solve this problem. And he watched as members of the Klan were arrested, often by Union soldiers, but then local courts and state courts would invariably acquit them. And so Grant steps forward to say the federal government will not allow this to happen. What's really interesting is Abraham Lincoln a wonderful person, a metaphor and analogy, tells the story of two men who are wrestling. And the more they wrestle out of each other's clothes into the clothes of the other. So what he was talking about was the changing understanding of parties from the Revolution to the present. But in the 19th century, the Democratic Party was the party of states' rights, and the Republican Party was the party of a strong central government. And so the reason that the Klan wanted to beat down on African Americans was because African Americans voted 80 to 90% for the Republican Party in local elections, state elections, and national elections. And they wanted to stop those African Americans from voting. I discovered to my great surprise that 36% of the Union Army was African American. Why was that? Because they enlisted late, 1863, 4 or 5. And so here you had African Americans on the streets of New Orleans or Memphis or Atlanta. It created a combustible situation. Grant stepped forward. Frederick Douglass, well, we've got to get him elected here first. Grant had a great sense of humor. I wish we had more humor in our politics today. So here, Grant ran with Colfax, and Grant's father was a tanner in Georgetown, Ohio. And so look at this thing. They're going to tan their opponents. And you can see who the opponents are. Grant and Colfax, tanners. What an interesting kind of broadside. And then this person, Frederick Douglass, campaigned vigorously for Grant. He was a little mixed about Lincoln, but not about Grant. If you have not had your opportunity to do so, David Blight won the Pulitzer Prize, I think 3 years ago maybe now, for his marvelous biography of Frederick Douglass. And he tells the story of how Douglass was such a really wonderful advocate for Ulysses S. Grant because he understood that Grant wanted to defend the rights of the freed men and women. But this is what's really going on. Take a look at this. Here you see a kind of a white leaguer and a Ku Klux Klaner. You can see what they're doing. They're holding, and this African-American couple is holding an infant in their arms that is either dead or dying. And this is a Thomas Nast cartoon, sort of showing the dilemma that was taking place in this country. And Ulysses S. Grant determined to confront this. So he wins the second term in 1872 and is elected. And right after his election, a group of African Americans from Philadelphia come to visit him. And this is what they said: "You are the first president elected by the whole people." They wanted him to know that he represented the practical establishment of our Republican theories. Grant responded, "In your desire to obtain all the rights of citizens, I fully sympathize." And then he spelled out what he meant. "A ticket on a railroad or other conveyance should entitle you to all that it does other men." In that spirit, he told them, "I wish every voter of the United States should stand in all respects alike. It must come." It would be 90 years before it began to come. It still has not come. And Grant was the last American president to stand for the rights of all citizens to have their vote. And African Americans recognize that. Well, moving quickly, let me just give our final story of Grant. Grant retires from the presidency. There's no pension in those days. He's always a great fan of travel. He thinks that this is so educational. So he starts out on what he thinks first will be 6 to 9 months. He goes for 2.5 years in his travel. And wherever he goes, to his great surprise, he's celebrated as great American hero. No American president had ever done what he had done. He goes to India, and he doesn't particularly like the way the British are treating the Indians. He goes to China, and when he gets to Japan, the Japanese say to him, "You know, we have such great respect for you. We are having a huge conflict with China. Would you be the mediator between China and Japan?" The mediator. In 1912, years after Grant's death, a group of Japanese dignitaries came to the United States, and they were asked in Washington, "What would you like to do?" "We want to go to New York. We want to visit Grant's tomb." We want to put a wreath there. This man means so much to our country. I don't think we quite realize how Grant is viewed around the world. When his death occurred, a funeral service was held in Westminster Abbey, and there were more people that wanted to come than could actually be seated. So Grant travels around the world for those 2.5 years. He comes back, tries his hand at this, that, or the other. His son gets involved in a Wall Street firm, and Grant gives his money, what he had, to his son. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's a Ponzi scheme. Grant and his son put in the money. The other guys didn't put in any. And one day, Grant comes to Wall Street and realizes he's lost everything. He comes home to Julia, and between the two of them, they have $150. It's all gone. Then, in his summer vacation on the shore of New Jersey, one day he bites into a summer peach and feels this incredible pain in his throat. His doctor's away on a 3-month holiday in Europe, which he often does, so Grant never saw the doctor till October. The doctor diagnoses him with terminal cancer. Terminal cancer. Now, Grant never intended to write his memoirs. He thought they were self-serving. They were settling scores. He didn't like Sherman's memoir, which was written in 1875. Do you know that during the administration of Dwight Eisenhower, 8 years, only one memoir was ever written? Would you like to think how many have been written in the previous 2, 3 presidents, and this one and the next one and whatever, you know? We all write our memoirs. We're 35 years old, but we write our memoirs. So finally, the only way he can provide for Julia is to write a memoir. And the Century magazine, the largest circulating magazine of the day, had paid Grant $500 each to write articles on Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chattanooga. They said, we'll offer you $10,000 to write your memoirs. That's a lot of money. But Mark Twain heard about it. And Mark Twain had just this love affair with Grant. He rushes over to Grant's residence in New York. He said, $10,000, that's what you'd pay to an unnamed Indian to write his memoirs. I'll tell you what I'll do. You write your memoirs and I'll give you 70% of the profits. 70% of them, not a 10% royalty, 70% of the profits. So Grant starts out to write his memoirs. He's a good writer. He doesn't even quite know that he's a good writer. Mark Twain knows that he's a good writer. So Twain hires a stenographer so that to speed the process, because Grant is failing in his health, and he starts dictating his memoir. But then Grant can no longer speak, and the stenographer is of no use. And so Grant is in a terribly difficult time. His illness progresses. On March 4, 1885, the newspapers are just around his house. The word in the New York Times, every other paper, Grant is on his deathbed. And Mark Twain writes this amazing note in his own diary. I just find it incredible. General Grant is still living this morning. Many a person between the two oceans lay hours awake last night, listening for the booming of the fire bells that should speak to the nation in simultaneous voice and tell of its calamity. He specified, the bell strokes are to be 30 seconds apart, and there will be 63, the general's age. They will be striking in every town of the United States at the same moment. This is the love and affection for Ulysses S. Grant. The doctor tells him that he's got to move to Saratoga Springs outside of New York City, get away from the heat and humidity. So he goes to what today is Grant's cottage. If you ever have a chance to do that and see that, it's really worth doing. And there one evening, as his stenographer can no longer help him, Grant can no longer speak. He writes a series of notes, and you can read these notes at the Library of Congress. This is what one of them wrote, he wrote to his doctor. I said I had been adding to my book and to my coffin. I presume every writing of the mind or body is one more nail in my coffin. And the doctors said that they understood that Grant only lived to finish the memoirs. He finished them 3 days before he died. Well, here's a nasty cartoon of all the problems that Grant is confronting in his second term in office. But here he is, he's lost 60, 70, 75 pounds, he's wrapped in a shawl, he's sitting there at Grant's cottage near Saratoga Springs trying to complete his memoirs. And so he does, and the memoirs will earn Julia $450,000 of 19th century money to provide for her. So what are we saying? I think we're saying if we can now take a fresh look at Ulysses S. Grant, he does deserve to be one of our great heroes. In the year 1900, Theodore Roosevelt said, similar to the panel we showed earlier, of the great living dead, there are three: Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. But even more interesting, what he says, and of second rank is Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Andrew Jackson, of second rank. But throughout most of the 20th century, this whole story of Grant disappeared. And tonight, and in this moment of his bicentennial, I think all of us have an opportunity to take a fresh look. My editor was right. Grant deserves an upgrade. Thank you very much.
Professor White, thank you so much for those wonderful words about our second favorite president here at the Union League. We do have some time for questions. Jim Mundy, our historian, has a mic back here, and I think, is it Becca? Chris right here. Mr. Gleason.
May I bring kudos to Jim Mundy. When I first came here, and I've had several times with Jim, he's such a marvelous person. We talked about trying to put on a grand event here. Now we are here.
I would certainly echo that, and thank you so very much for your presentation. What, with all the work that you've done, what would you attribute this remarkable man's fall from grace to? How was it that he slipped from that first ranking?
It's a very good question. Let me just also shift this one more. Now here are the Grant memoirs, 2 volumes. I suggested early on that it was the lost cause, the story coming from the South generals and editors. But also, surprisingly, it was a school of historians, even someone named William Dunning, who was teaching at Columbia University, but who was a Southerner, and who depicted everything that took place in the Reconstruction as something terrible. And of course, if you think about it now, with the kind of whole story of the statues and taking them down and up, why, you're not going to celebrate someone who's standing up for the rights of African Americans. That was not something you did in 1880 or 1900 or 1920 or 1940. It's interesting, it didn't begin in the Civil Rights era. Even still, Grant was not there. But a big part of this was the Grant papers, because the papers of all the other presidents were way before Grant. And finally, in 1967, someone said, well, don't you think we ought to do some papers of Grant? And they weren't completed until 2017. So even some of the biographies written in the 80s and 90s or stories of Grant, they didn't have access to these papers. And they give a much fuller understanding of who is this person. The person I quoted at the beginning, William Heseltine, in 1935, he said, well, the Grant papers are all over the place. He didn't know where they were. Now we have this incredible collection of the Grant papers. It gives us a perception of him that we can see that people before did not have.
Thank you, Kira.
Could you reflect on some of the similarities and differences or the influence of Napoleon on Grant? there seemed to be some similarity, like as a military tactician, as a leader. Could you,
Of Napoleon and Grant?
yes,
I wish I was an expert on Napoleon.
they both seem to just want to attack, always on the move.
Oh, okay, well, and of course, Napoleon was the great figure. When West Point kind of finally got going, it was kind of people were not, Jefferson, for example, wasn't sure that we should have a West Point, because the problem with the French Revolution was that the standing armies were running against the people. But then he changed his mind and thought, no, West Point will be a place where common families will send their common sons, and this will be a volunteer army in a certain sense going forward. So yes, Grant's strategy, if this is parallel to Napoleon, was that heretofore when armies fought, think of Gettysburg, you fight for 3 days and then you stop and you refit and you take care of the wounded. And so what Lee would do in these battles was he would shift his army to meet the attacking force of the Union Army. And Grant said, well, if I keep attacking, Lee cannot do that. I will just attack. And that's what Petraeus sees in him that's so remarkable. The other part of Grant that is so remarkable is that there were 5 Union armies in the East, 5 Union armies. And Grant figured out that these armies had all been fighting somewhat separately, separate commanders, separate strategies. I want to combine them together so that ultimately we will all converge mostly on Richmond. But I want to coordinate these. So we think of him in the Battle of the Wilderness and the battles in Virginia, but he was also coordinating other armies. And this is where, again, Petraeus says he had a sense of the strategy of battle. Our battlefields are so much larger than any European battlefields. The geography that we're covering is so different. There'd never been anything like this before. And the fact that you graduated from West Point #1 in your class didn't mean you could do this. Grant finished 22nd out of 39 in his class. But he had a terrific conception of maps. He had the ability to kind of almost imagine the terrain and to sort of almost foresee how will Lee respond. And this became part of his genius.
Kira, we have a question over here.
What do you think made him such a paradox of an individual, somebody who hated the Mexican War that he served in and was also so benevolent to his enemies, but he was also called a butcher?
That's a great question, the irony or the paradox. Because when Grant finally travels over to Europe on his 2.5-year journey, he meets Bismarck. And Bismarck says to him, you are a terrific general. He said, no, I don't like war. And so how could that be? But Grant believed, as Lincoln believed, that there had to be a hard war if there was going to be a soft peace. This was the cost of preserving the Union. And so Grant, early on in his first battle, and Senator Roy Blunt, who was speaking this morning in Washington, made a big case out of this. I thought he was great. Grant is fighting this battle in northwest Missouri, and his heart is in his throat, and he's nervous, and suddenly he thinks, I think the other guy is just as nervous as I am. And so he was able to go forward. He had this remarkable courage, and yet he would be absolutely broken up when one of his generals was killed, for example. He had both of these qualities at once.
Question over here.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm a life member of the Union League.
Yes.
Proud to have you here.
Yes, thank you.
But I was born in Alabama.
Okay.
So I have a particular sensitivity to things
Right.
that you alluded to. I went to a talk hosted by a New Yorker friend of mine, which happened to be very close to the Grant's tomb.
Uh-huh.
And so it was very nostalgic, and it wasn't the point of the meeting, but he told us, the audience, that when Grant was, I guess, honored by being entombed there, that Robert E. Lee's widow came with Mrs. Grant to that ceremony, offering to do that, and accepted by Mrs. Grant, and that it was a very moving ceremony. Is that true, or is that a story they make up to make guys like me happy?
There's layers to that story. First of all, what happened when Grant had a 9.5-mile pilgrimage up Manhattan, 1.5 million people came 500,000 came from outside of New York by train and by boat. And what was most remarkable was the lead carriage had 4 generals, the 2 leading Union generals, Sherman and Sheridan, and the 2 leading living Confederate generals, Joe Johnston and Simon Bolivar Buckner. And the 4 of them rode together because they had a huge respect for Grant. Not as much for Sherman, but a huge respect for Grant. Now, I don't know about Mrs. Lee there, but the story is a little different than I could tell, is that one day after Grant's death, Julia Dent was vacationing up the Hudson River, and she understood that a woman who was there was also a widow, and her name was Verena Davis, the widow of Jefferson Davis. And she went over and knocked on her door and introduced herself. And the 2 of them became fast friends. And people would see them driving down in a buggy on Fifth Avenue. Here are these 2 women together. So she had her own reconciliation. She reached out to Verena Davis. I think that's kind of an amazing story that is true. I don't know about Robert E. Lee's widow.
Question.
How much stock or credence do you put in the argument by Eric Foner and others that in exchange for the continued subjugation of the South after 1876, that Grant allowed basically the Bourbon Democrats to take control in exchange for the election of Rutherford B. Hayes and the acceptance of his presidency?
Well, it's hard to go against Eric Foner. Grant was never a fan of Rutherford B. Hayes. Julia, to have a little spite, Mrs. Hayes was a teetotaler. So Julia left liquor all throughout the house. She had a great sense of humor. And I stand by the story that Grant stood up for the freedmen. And when Hayes finished his first term and there was absolutely no possibility he could ever be elected to a second term, there was a huge movement to elect Grant. And he wasn't quite sure about that. The Republican convention was taking place, and Julia urged him to go to the convention. She said, if you go to that convention, you will win the nomination. I don't know that he wanted the nomination. I think he was tired of this. He thought it was time to pass the baton. But Grant was very much for the elevation of the freedmen, and this, to me, is part of his legacy.
Kara, question over here.
Professor, I was hoping you could give a few words. We've learned about the development of Grant, the general, and Grant, the president. If you give a few words to the personal development of Grant as the abolitionist.
As the abolitionist. This is an interesting story that I found puzzling when I first encountered Grant. Grant's father was a strongly anti-slavery, and he sent him to one school in Ripley, Ohio, run by John Rankin, who was part of the Underground Railroad. And yet Grant did not appear to be anti-slavery when he entered the war. As a military general, he literally said, well, I will do whatever the policy is, and if this is the policy, I will follow it out. But then I believe that when he went further and further south, and African Americans were beginning to come into the Union lines, and he began to sense and empathize with their plight, that his whole demeanor, this was no longer some policy issue, this was a personal issue for him. And therefore it finally comes forward in his presidency that he will defend these people. If you get to the Ulysses S. Grant home right outside of St. Louis, it's remarkable. It's the United States National Park Service. They will show you a film, and the beginning of the film is this remarkable story. As I said earlier, Grant's father-in-law was an ardent secessionist, and at their wedding, he gave Julia 4 slaves. They had 39 slaves on where they lived. But Grant got rid of them, and then as Grant was really struggling in 1859 economically, he had 1 slave left, a very able strong, muscular male slave, about 31 years of age. Grant never talks about things like this. One day he walked into St. Louis and signed the manumission papers. I can no longer own this slave. He could have gotten easily $1,000 or $1,500, and he was really struggling economically. But typical of Grant, he's never going to pat himself on the shoulder and say, I did this because, but he did it. And that's a remarkable story that he manumitted, freed this slave at the moment of his most difficult economic plight. Yes.
There's a wonderful statue of Grant by Boathouse Row here in Philadelphia. Probably unappreciated, but if you ever by there on Kelly Drive.
I would love to see it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Just the personal dynamic between Grant and Lee before, during, after the war?
Right. Good question. Well, when they finally come together at Appomattox, Lee, as you remember, is all dressed in his dress uniform, wearing his sword. He's a handsome man. Grant coming in from the field, not trying to be disrespectful, but his boots are muddy. He's kind of just wearing his regular old uniform. And Grant says something like this to Lee. They had been in the war in Mexico together, but Lee was a big figure in the war with Mexico. And so Grant says something like, I remember you from the war in Mexico. I mean, he admired Lee. They were a half a generation at least apart in age. And Lee, in a certain sense, not being disrespectful, he says, well, I don't really remember you. And there's no reason that he should have, because Grant was a minor player in that war. He was kind of a wholly different role. Did they meet after the war? The one thing that I think is really important, and I think of this when we're all wishing to, I'm not, but wishing to tear down all these statues. Andrew Johnson wanted to try Lee as a traitor, and Grant says, you will not try him as a traitor. He is the spirit of the South, and we will treat him with respect. It seems so difficult for people today to understand that you could have a real difference in terms of the values of the two sides, certainly the value of slavery, but that you could treat people with respect. I'm now writing a biography of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top. And I know I'm going to run into difficulty because Chamberlain was what you would call a reconciliationist. He was all for reconciliation. He would say again and again and again and again, I admire the manly courage of the Southern. So I don't support their cause, but I support their courage. Well, that's very hard to say today. I mean, you don't care about slavery? Of course they cared about slavery, but we don't seem to be very much into nuance today. It's either this or that. And I think it's sad that we cannot reconcile ourselves to who people were in the 18th century or the 19th century. That's my point of view.
Time for one more question.
Hi. So I watch the news and I find myself thinking frequently, I wish I could sit down with some of these amazing, politicians and presidents of the past, and I wonder what they would say about what we're seeing now about the slander and the misinformation and all of the media and what people are saying about American values and about this party. So what do you think that Ulysses S. Grant, as an abolitionist, as a Republican, as a leader of the Union, would say if he watched our news right now?
Thank you. Well, first of all, when I speak on Lincoln, I always want to make the point, which I didn't make tonight on Grant, that Lincoln's a 19th century person. He can't help us with climate change. He can't tell us what to do in Ukraine. His views on women are not the views that we would have today. And so it's very difficult to answer your question. I think he would be disturbed because his whole goal, he runs on this simple campaign, but very profound, let us have peace. And he really believed that the Republican Party had a role in the South, and he spent a great deal of time in the South, the white Republican Party and the black Republican Party. And so the idea that we do not respect each other, he would want to say we are all Americans. We all love our country. We may have different ideas or different policy issues, but please don't say you're a good American and you're not a good American. I think all of us love our country. And that would be the legacy of both Lincoln and Grant. And if we could simply have that legacy, we might be able to have much more thoughtful conversations. The 24/7 news cycle doesn't help at all, because Lincoln wanted to take his time before he responded to the Dred Scott decision. He took 3 months before he said a word about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened the possibility that slavery could extend west into the territories. And now we ask people in 30 seconds, tell us what you just thought about bubble. And I think that we're not giving our leaders and ourselves. When's the last time you deleted an email? When the last time you decided not to send it? I'll just close with this story, and then that's enough. At Gettysburg, the Union Army wins this decisive victory. Lincoln's in the telegraph office, and George Meade and Robert E. Lee is limping back to Virginia, a battered army, trying to get across the Potomac so his men can refit and hopefully live to fight another day. And Meade stays in Gettysburg. And Lincoln is beside himself with anger. Finally, Meade starts out late after Lee. Lee gets to the Potomac River and it's flooded and he can't cross it. But by the time Meade gets there, the last soldier of the Confederate Army has crossed over. So Lincoln sits down and writes this letter. Do you not understand what you have done? You have cost us at least one more year of this war. How could you possibly? But I've been to the vault at the Library of Congress. This remarkable letter. On the envelope, it says, never signed, never sent. Never signed, never sent. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Never said.
Professor White.
Did he want Meade to resign? Of course not. And so the part of leadership is not what you say, but what you don't say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Ron White, everyone. Thank you. If you haven't yet had enough of Grant, please go to our YouTube page. Jim Mundy has a Mondays with Monday that's about Grant and the Union League of Philadelphia. So please go to our YouTube page and check that out. And also we'll see you on May 5th for John Yoo. Professor White will be in the back to sign a few more books as well. Thank you. And if we have any students, why don't we meet in the back and we'll get a picture with the professor.